Sir Adam, I wanted to start with the question. On the eve of February 24, you gave an interview. It was February 16, so it was a week in advance before Russia started a war in Ukraine. And your quote is like this: "You would be in for 2 generations of renewed Cold War and confrontation. There would be appalling scenes that would polarize Russia and the West for years to come." Did you already foresee the terrible events that would come afterwards? Why you said that on 16 of February?
Well, I'd like to claim that I was brilliantly foresighted, but I think I said, possibly in the same interview, but certainly in the week before the invasion, that it wasn't going to happen because President Putin wouldn't do anything that stupid. It would be, I think I said, a strategic mistake. But I believe that what I said would happen if the invasion took place has come to pass. I'm terribly sad to say it, but I believe we are looking at 2 generations of Cold War. We have seen appalling things, and that has polarized Russia and the West for years to come. It will be immensely difficult to unwind it. It is such a tragedy.
Please pardon the inaccuracy in quotes because they were translated, but I hope I'll get the point. "Russians don't like to lose ground," you wrote, "even if, or especially if, the other party is in the right. So it's no use, both in interpersonal and international relations, to threaten Russians and try to make them admit that they are wrong by rejecting their position publicly and loudly. They will just feel a greater necessity to withstand." You, I think, are quite right about this, but in this same, you were quite astute. Just after 1 year of living in Russia, you learned a lot about Russian character. So, with that quote in mind, do you think that the anti-Russian sanctions and everything that happened after invasion on 24th of February is a good idea?
It's a good idea, but it's not an effective idea. It was quite clear that this is not going to produce the result that the Western economies hoped, or the Western governments. What the theory was to make the middle class so upset, so annoyed, so angry at being deprived of its freedoms that it had to travel, to buy things from abroad and all that, that they would put pressure on the Kremlin to change the policy. This was never going to succeed. First of all, the Kremlin doesn't really care about the middle class. And secondly, there's no way they can put pressure on the government in this way. In fact, it's backfired because all Putin has to do is to say, you see, I'm afraid there are shortages of this, we can't do that. You see how the West hates us. You see they're trying to punish us. You see the hostility from the West. You can't do what you've been used to doing. And of course, what can we do? It's the West's fault. And many people believe that.
So does West understand that so it puts water on a mill of Russian propaganda, as you already say?
Yes.
Why these decisions were taken in this way?
Well, I think people thought we simply cannot go on treating Russia as a normal trading partner. We can't say business continues even though we disagree on politics. And that's been the case not just with Russia, but other places such as Iran, where there's a fundamental disagreement. Now, in some countries, if the country is not very big and it doesn't have a big economy, it can be an effective instrument because if you really hurt the economy, then the government has to do something different. With Russia, it's an enormous economy and it has other options. It can sell its oil to India, to China, to lots of other countries. And in fact, I mean, what has amazed and surprised and rather angered the West is that the international organizations such as World Bank or IMF, they are forecasting that Russian economy will grow faster next year than Britain's economy, even with sanctions.
So first of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity and say my personal gratitude to you because I was quite a little girl I was doing a blonde show on a Russian TV, a reality show, and I knew nothing and was not interested in Russian politics. And the first ever case in my personal life when I heard about this was Magnitsky case. I cried all night through. I was so much impressed. And actually for me it started, a long journey to another kind of journalism. But what I mean that now Russia is subjected to unprecedented sanctions, and you are, so to say, the godfather of them. You were the first one to invent this mechanism. Do you feel proud about this, and do you think that now this mechanism at last works effectively?
Well, so part of the reason I did this was for justice for Sergei Magnitsky. This is not true justice. So Sergei was tortured in prison for 358 days. He was sick. He was denied medical care. He was chained to a bed. He was beaten by riot guards and killed. And so it's hardly satisfying to freeze somebody's assets when the people who killed him should be in jail for torture and murder. And so I don't think that this is any great success. I think that freezing assets of human rights violators and kleptocrats is better than total impunity, but it's not something. I don't sit at night proud of myself. I sit at night frustrated that the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky are still running around, living the good life, and not in jail.
At last, is it effective, this mechanism of personal sanctions? As much as I understand, you think it's the right way, apart from big sanctions imposed on simple people of Russia, which we will talk, of course. But this mechanism of sanctioning personally, now it works?
Well, so Russia is a very unique country. Of all the countries in the world, in Russia, the wealth of the country is so unbelievably concentrated. So few people have the money, and so many people live in destitute poverty, that it creates a terrible unfairness for the average Russian person. But from the standpoint of justice, that concentration of wealth actually creates a big opportunity to create some type of consequence. And because there's only, let's say, 10,000 people that have all the money in Russia, and you can target them individually with these sanctions, and you can go after their money, which many people value more than human life. So the dysfunction of Russia has created a legal opportunity to create real trouble for the people who are causing so much trouble for the Russian people, who are violating everyone's rights and who are stealing all the money of the people. So in one way, the sanctions are extremely effective. And you don't have to sanction all 10,000 of them. You can sanction 1,000 of them, and every other person who's unsanctioned is looking over their shoulders right and left and wondering if they're going to be next. And the purpose of this is to prevent people from doing terrible things. And is it preventing people from doing terrible things? I would imagine that in some cases people are saying, you know what, I don't want to be involved in this stuff.
We are doing this reportage, so to say, about sanctions and how people feel about them in the West. And of course, I know some of the people, businessmen, who were sanctioned. And what they say, that really, I don't know if it's true or not, but from their words, they didn't even get explanation of those sanctions.
I don't have a huge amount of sympathy for Russian people who are complaining about sanctions. Wealthy people who are whining about not being able to access their money, I think are pretty low in the hierarchy of sympathy right now.
West didn't think of a way of dividing those who support Russians who support war and who want this war to happen, and those who don't want, this middle class who wants, their money to be safe in some banks. They want to live a Western life and maybe to flee the Russia. So why not create a situation when everyone who wants to leave Russia and to make their money invest in the West, why not make them this opportunity
Well, that's rather difficult. First of all, we can't really be sure how many would like to leave. Quite a lot of people would like to leave out of opportunism, not because they're opposed to Putin, but they suddenly think, here's a chance to go and emigrate to the West. We've always wanted to do that. We think we can be more successful. It's like being economic migrants. They're not necessarily political asylum seekers. And the numbers could be quite uncontrollable. As it is, Britain was fairly reluctant to accept many Ukrainians. Poland was much more open to Ukrainians. And those that came, yes, there was a welcome, but it wasn't that warm. It wasn't because there's a general feeling that too many migrants or immigrants or asylum seekers from all over the world are coming to Britain, and that we've got too many of them, and we don't want that. The other thing is, it's very difficult to know how to influence Russians inside Russia as to how they should respond. The West can't really influence the social and the political situation inside the country. Turkey, for its own interests, is sitting on the fence on this one, trying to play it both ways. And Erdogan is doing that because he wants to, first of all, make some money, which is very successful, and secondly, to pose as an international peacekeeper or possible mediator, which would boost his standing inside Turkey. The result is that it's made him rather suspect by his NATO allies, who are wondering what sort of game he's playing. You know, is he playing both sides? But you can't force every country to choose a side. I mean, the West is trying to persuade India and South Africa and Turkey and these other ones to vote against Russia. But in fact, there's only a limited amount of pressure you can put on these countries. And I think if you push too hard, you will get a counter-reaction. And that's the problem. You have to try to make it clear that they should be against what's happened because it's wrong, not because America and NATO are saying you must be against it. They should decide for themselves whether it's a good idea for Russia to take this action or not, and then make their own decision.
I read your interview in which you talk about the Magnitsky case as being totally innovative idea. Innovative in the sense that previous sanctions were imposed on entire nations, and you convinced them that it was much more effective to impose personal sanctions, as we talked already. Am I correct that I'm assuming that you believe that ordinary citizens should not suffer from the actions aimed to punish the government and people close to government of Russia?
Well, that's always been my position. I always felt like the people of Russia were living in an occupied country. The occupation was a criminal occupation, and that most of them were victims, not perpetrators. I've started to change my view based on the conduct of Russian people during the war. I see a lot of support for the killing of Ukrainians among regular Russian citizens, and the more I see that, the more I become convinced that it's not just Vladimir Putin, it's not just the people of his regime, but there's, I think, 80% support for the war in Russia.
So you changed your position. Now you think that it is fair that simple Russian citizens should be also punished?
I think if the majority of Russian citizens are supporting the war, then the majority of the Russian citizens are also complicit in this war.
But how to segregate? It's quite difficult. How to segregate people who do not support and, for example, afraid to say that they do not support because they can go under prison, from those who do support?
Well, it's a really, we're in a war right now, and the war and the vast majority, the very, very vast majority of victims are not in Russia. The victims are the ones who are fleeing for their lives, who are being mutilated and
That's true,
tortured, and I think that this. I can't even begin to have to think about what the hardships of normal Russians when I look at what the Russian military, what the Russian government is doing in Ukraine, and when I look at that, and I look at the support for that from the Russian people, I can't even begin to think about having any sympathetic thoughts about whether somebody can buy Western goods or not in Russia. I think about the victims of Ukraine.
But it's not about sympathy. It's again about, laws. Of course, we cannot compare, and I don't think, well, I think it's quite manipulative to compare. Of course, what Ukrainian people are now undergoing is totally catastrophe and cannot be compared with some bad things happening to Russians that cannot go study to countries they want, cannot travel or something like this. We're not comparing at all, but still, is it fair? That's my question. Like, for example, there are many people who do not support war, but they're afraid to say it out loud because they will go to prison. Should they suffer the same mechanism that will take all the Russians like a nation being, blamed for this war?
Well, I have friends who have stood up to Vladimir Putin and are facing prison. Vladimir Karamurza called Putin a murderer on CNN, and he's now facing 24 years in prison.
Navalny, Yashin, many of them, but that's, how to say, that's a hero act. And
it's not a hero act. It's if I think something like 700,000 Russians have left the country. If those 700,000 Russians hadn't left the country and had all marched on Red Square, then Putin would no longer be president, and this war would no longer be going on.
But do you think it's correct to blame people for not going out if they're afraid and if they don't want to suffer, circumstances like going to prison or whatever?
Well, I think that collectively the Russian people are enabling Vladimir Putin to do this. He couldn't do this if he didn't have the support of the Russian people. And
look, that's an interesting story because here, for example, in Western society, as far as I know, it's called victim blaming. Like, for example, if a woman got raped, and you start blaming her, like, why you didn't fight, you just, stood up and someone raped you, why you didn't fight or called and cried out. It's called victim blaming, and it's, like, very bad. Don't you think to blame people not going out on the streets because they're afraid for their children, they don't want to go to prison, they don't want any problems with law because it's a dictatorship? It's not a normal situation when you can go out and say something.
After Sergei Magnitsky was murdered, I was screaming bloody murder about his murder. And a lot of Russians didn't want to hear it. It's like all they cared about was going to work, getting their money, having fun, going on their vacations. They didn't want to hear it. And what I saw in Russia was this totally narrow psychology, which is I care for me, I care for my family, and I don't care about anybody else.
But it's not only in Russia; it's in any country.
I live here, and I've lived in Russia.
I have a lot of friends in London. I have lots of friends in France, and many of them say, we don't care about war in Ukraine. Okay, we think it's not good, it's not fair, but why we have to pay double price for electricity? We just want to live and pay less, and we want to care for our family.
Well, in my experience here in the UK, I know many families, including people very close to me, who are bringing in Ukrainian refugees.
Yes, of course. There are many like this, but there are also others. It's like in any society, many people with different views. When there's freedom of speech, there are people who support and give money to Ukraine army. And I know I have lots of friends who do like this in London. But there are also people, and usually it's people, with less amount of money, just hardworking people who just say, look, we don't care. We want to live and pay less. And also these people exist.
Yeah, but I would argue that in Russia, it's a very extreme version of this where, you can go into somebody's apartment in Moscow, the nicest apartment you can ever see, marble and art and beautiful furniture, and then you step out into the hallway and it smells of urine because people are so focused just on their own internal space and there's no sense of community whatsoever. And I think that's really why we are in this situation today, because everybody narrowly focused on their own personal interests in Russia, and the Putin regime, Vladimir Putin, was able to capitalize on that and give people, he would find all the people in the important positions, make sure that they were taken care of. Everyone else is in poverty, and now here we are.
That's understandable. I'm, being a Russian person, living in Russia and not going out because I understand the next time all my resources will be closed and I will be in prison. I'm talking about this point, about, for me, to give you an example, it's like, I don't know, for example, you're with an aggressor in a room. Yeah, and he's bigger than you. He's like, I don't know, Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson and a girl stuck in this room, and he starts beating her. And there are many people who sit near the house. And what they do, instead of breaking the windows and saying to the girl, go out, we will welcome you, come here, run away, because of course physically she cannot fight Mike Tyson. Instead of this, they're starting closing the windows and saying, look, deal with him, we will give you advice, beat him from left to right, do something. And that's kind of immoral because, simple people in Russia, they're afraid of Mr. Putin. They don't want to go to prison. And what they see from here, they see advice, go on the streets, stop keeping silent. But they understand that this advice would lead them to prison. They don't want to go to prison. Do you think it's fair to give that kind of advice instead of opening the, the boards and say everyone who is not agreeing with the war will get passports in 2 weeks, will have all the accounts opened. So people should have an alternative if they're not.
Here we are, the Ukrainian people are the ones who have priority. The Ukrainian refugees have priority. There's only a certain capacity for the West. Why are there millions of Ukrainian refugees? Because they've been bombed, they've been shot, they've been blown up by Russian bombs. We have sympathy for the Ukrainian victims.
That's understandable, but then don't you think it's more moral to say, sorry, we cannot accept you because we have a priority for Ukrainians, and that, in my opinion, will be fair. But if we cannot accept you, we are not pushing you to the streets, we are not, putting more pressure on you, we're just saying we cannot accept you. But we are not closing this window, seeing that Mike Tyson is, aggressing you.
Well, in my opinion, the economic inconveniences that are being suffered by Russian people are a very minor problem compared to what's going on in the world right now.
Compared, yes, but minor problems also matters.
Minor problems don't matter when you're dealing with a catastrophe, a human catastrophe.
Do you think that by canceling, Russian culture, Russian students, Russian, scientists, and so on, this process is like West pushes people in the hands of Putin because they have nowhere to go else, and they will be pushed back to him, so to say.
It's very foolish to try to cancel Russian culture, to boycott a country entirely. Nobody is at war with the Russian people. Nobody is saying we must destroy Russia as a country, destroy its culture, destroy its offerings. It's important to keep as many links open as possible, as long as these are not governmental links. Now, that's quite difficult. I think it's reasonable, as part of an attempt to put on pressure, to stop airlines flying in and out to each other's countries. But of course, that means there won't be many tourists, there won't be people coming over here. And that does cut off Russians to some extent. And I'm afraid that is unpleasant and sad, but it's inevitable, particularly in a state of extreme tension. I think the idea of cancelling things like Russian music, we won't listen to Tchaikovsky, we're not going to read Tolstoy, not going to eat blini, this is idiotic. One or two things happened like this in the First World War in Britain, where there was a great attempt to smash German shops in London. And any shopkeeper who had a German name, crowds went and smashed the windows and tore it down because, they're Germans and we're fighting the Germans. It was extremely stupid, discriminatory, and counterproductive. And I can see why Russians would be very offended, feeling, well, they all hate us. We have nothing to lose. They're all against us. There's no way that the West will ever accept us. If that's what they feel, then Putin has won.
Well, in my opinion, every Russian citizen has a duty, one way or another, to stand up to Putin, whether it's going onto the streets or disrupting operations, or everybody has a duty to oppose Putin. And those who
a mother of 3 children who bears them alone, has no husband, should risk and go on the street knowing that she can be taken to prison and her children would go to the
orphanage.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can always find examples.
There are many examples like this. There are many women in Russia who bear
and
children.
the women from Ukraine many women have become refugees, and the men have fought.
Of course, but we're not comparing. Just can you say, you personally, you Bill Browder, can you say to this woman, go on the street? Like this concrete woman, Maria Ivanovna, with 3 children.
I don't know this hypothetical woman, but what I can say is that generally, the reason why you have Putin is because everybody has been living a very narrow, selfish, private life and has not chosen to look after the interests of the country.
We have another example in the Soviet Union, when everyone who could escape the country was embraced by the West and given all the opportunities, and like the only problem was to get behind this iron wall. But if a person got out, he got all the kind of support. So why you think this example didn't serve West now?
Well, the situations are very different. I mean, 1 or 2 people managing to get across the Berlin Wall is rather different from Russian tourists eating and drinking in Helsinki. And there are different reactions to those 2 kinds of behavior. But I think it's partly that sanctions are a blunt instrument. So the Russian people are collateral damage from the harm that is being done to the Russian economy. But it is also clearly the case that sanctions have been used against things that have nothing to do with the war. Russian culture, Russian tennis players, Russian opera singers, and Russian tourists. And in my view, this is a real mistake. Like I say, I think some inside the European Union and in NATO genuinely think that sanctioning Russian tourists, preventing them from traveling, has useful political effects. But some of it is just emotion. Look at, Wimbledon, from which Russians were not allowed to, where they were banned from playing as Russians. That was an emotional response. If you like, a political response, a judgment by the organizers of that tennis tournament about what would play most acceptably to their larger audience. And people at the time, images of Bucha on their television screens and were very upset. So all things Russian were terrible. It is very difficult for Finns or Estonians to be sitting as neighbors of Russia, Russia doing these terrible things in Ukraine, and then having well-to-do Russian middle-class tourists coming and having a nice time in their capitals. It's not, I think, a rational calculation. It's a political and emotional one, if you like. But as I say, I think it's not smart policy. If you believe, as I do, that this confrontation is going to be with us for a couple decades in one form or another, it's vitally important for the West to remain open to Russians if we want Russian minds to remain open to the West.
Exactly.
It's a strategic judgment.
Well, I've seen many people risk their security, their liberty to fight for their countries. This is not about whether you can go study abroad or whether you can buy an Apple phone or watch Netflix. This is a massive crisis situation in which the Russian people have a responsibility, and this is not a fight that you chose, but it's a fight you either have to take sides on. You can't just be neutral in this fight.
Yeah, but compared to Soviet Union and the situation during the Cold War, you remember that the position of the West was different. People who wanted to escape and who somehow fled the Soviet Union were welcomed, and they were giving aid. And that gave them a carrot, that gave them a choice between staying in a situation they don't like and keeping silent and going away.
Well,
And
isn't
now,
there a third choice, which is not keeping silent?
you mean in Russia?
Yeah.
Yes, but it's dangerous. Not many people want to go that danger.
Well, the danger may be necessary in order for Russia not to turn into North Korea.
Yeah, but it's kind of an example with Mike Tyson. Saying out of the window, fight with him, it's a bit of, well, I would say it's immoral advice, because it's kind of,
I think
go and be the meat. Of course, if 1 million of you will come out, you cannot put 1 million people to prison, but 100 of them will be killed or put to prison, so just go, and some of them will be killed. It's something,
I don't have a lot of sympathy. I was in Russia. I witnessed a lot of terrible things, and I didn't stay silent.
Yeah, but now you're here, and we're sitting in a comfortable place.
I'm not comfortable. The Russian government is chasing me with death threats, with kidnapping threats,
Yes,
with
but
arrest
you are in
warrants.
safe.
I haven't been safe. I've been arrested on more than one occasion. They've been chasing me with Interpol. I continue to stand
Yeah, but
up.
Interpol rejected many times to extradite you back, and as far as I understand, staying in London is kind of a safe situation for you now.
Not particularly. I mean, they murdered Alexander Litvinenko here. They tried to murder Sergei Skripal with Novichok. No place is safe standing up to Putin, but I choose to do it. I don't know why there's a lot of people in Russia that are upset about this, then they should stand up. I don't think it's a choice of, we just want to put our blinders on, just go about our business and have a comfortable life.
How do you view this war as a person who knows Russia well? And some talk about Putin's imperialistic war, that the metropolis wants to get back, colonies that were part of Soviet Union.
Well, it's not about recreating the whole of the Soviet Union. I don't think anyone in Moscow seriously thinks that Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and any of those countries should now rejoin in a political union. First of all, it was always a rather artificial political union in the first place. The other thing is, in terms of practical politics, they're never going to get the Baltics back. They're a separate region. It's basically the Slavic, Russian-speaking, it's Belarus and it's Ukraine. That's what matters, particularly Ukraine, because it's so big and it's been so long part of the Russian Empire. And so many Ukrainians have played a central role in the government of Russia or the Soviet Union or whatever in the past. That's why there's so much anger, the feeling the West was invading their space. And I made a comparison. If you think the Russians reacted over-emotionally and in a very kind of paranoid way, I made a comparison. I said, supposing on the eve of the referendum in Scotland for independence from Britain, the first referendum they had, supposing Lavrov had gone to the streets of Edinburgh and he had said, we will stand with you against English colonialism. We will support Scotland in its fight for freedom and we'll be there backing you all the way. What do you think the reaction in London would have been? They would have been absolutely furious. They say, what's it got to do with Russia? This bit of territory has been British for 300 years. The same when Victoria Nuland went to the Maidan in Kiev and said, "We stand with Ukraine." The Russians said, "What's she doing? American, this has nothing to do with her territory." And the reaction was very powerful. And you only, if you explain it to a Brit or an English person in those terms, then they begin to understand a little bit why it was so powerful.
But then why Americans did they? Didn't they understand that they will provoke aggression?
The Americans don't have a long cultural understanding of how the rest of the world works.
Yeah, but they can have an example of Mexico, and for
Yes.
them it can be explained like,
It hasn't
imagine
always
that in
worked with Mexico. Not very well. Americans are, in a large extent, a continent on their own. They have no real neighbors. Canada they consider part of America, more or less. Mexico doesn't really count. And the rest is just the sea. They don't have neighbors. And they don't have a long history of trying to work out how to live next door to people they either disagree with or they've fought against. Europe has got used to that over 1,000 years.
But why they did it? It's like why they escalated the situation. Maybe it was done on purpose.
I think it was done foolishly. I think my view is that the original NATO expansion was a silly idea because it was always going to be seen by Russia as a threatening idea. There was a proposal that Russia itself could join NATO. Well, that would have solved everything. But the expansion of NATO, having made a verbal promise, and I checked this with Gorbachev's interpreter, what exactly was said. And he said, yes, James Baker did make a promise that after East Germany, NATO would not push further east. But it was never written down, and it was never done in a kind of treaty form. Then Clinton wanted the Polish vote in Chicago, and Poland has always been suspicious of its neighbor, so said, we want the security of being part of NATO. And Clinton said, I will invite them in. And once you've opened the door to Poland, then everybody else wanted to join. And I think, frankly, that was a foolish move. And it increased Russian paranoia, particularly because those that wanted to join said, well, we want to join because it's an anti-Russian alliance. The West no longer said it's anti-Russian. They said it's a European security alliance. But the new members said, we want it because it stops the Russians. So the Russians immediately saw that it was directed against them. And that's why they felt angry about it. And that I can understand. I think that was, and the trouble was, Putin wanted it written down in black and white that there would be a veto on NATO membership for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The Western powers, they told him again and again, we can't give you a guarantee because it's a free choice. But we're telling you we have no intention of admitting Ukraine to NATO.
Yeah, but why not fulfill this thing? For example, I think it could save us all from this catastrophe that's going on. We know the mechanisms of lobbyism of Americans, so why they couldn't force the members by, different moves to
give a guarantee?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it was very difficult because it was seen as an attempt by Russia to dictate the terms of the members of NATO, which is not their alliance, to say, you cannot do that. And said, well, we decide what we will do. We're telling you unofficially, we will never invite Ukraine to be a member of NATO. But he said, well, I don't, how can I believe you? You haven't written it down.
А потом начали расширять НАТО на восток. Ну, естественно, мы же говорили, не надо этого делать. Вы нам обещали не делать. А нам говорят, а где это написано на бумажке? Нету? Ну и все, идите вы подальше. Плевать мы хотели на вашу озабоченность.
I think there's a lot in what we're seeing now that echoes the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Caribbean crisis of 1962, at least in Russian minds. And you have to have some sympathy with that. So in 1962, because there are American missiles on Soviet borders in Turkey and elsewhere, why is it not okay for Russia to put missiles into Cuba? But apparently it's not okay. Today, it's slightly the other way round. if it's not okay to put things in American backyard in 1962, why can't poor Moscow do things in its backyard today? Yeah, you can understand it, but it doesn't justify it.
Of course, no.
Apart from being an appalling strategic mistake, it's partly that at least in Europe, Europeans think that borders should be respected. They may not be quite so concerned about what goes on elsewhere in the world, but most of Ukraine feels like Europe nowadays. It's partly that the world has moved on since 1962, and the United States has at least not gone around annexing territory in the last century or so. It may have gone around invading a certain amount, but it hasn't actually gone about annexing a neighbor's territory without their consent.
Okay, let's have a quest. You're Mr. Putin. You see that Ukraine is flying away from you and the American influence on Ukraine is high, that's a true fact, even before this war. What he should do, to change the situation? You see that this big part on the borders is very influenced by someone who is quite hostile to you and who doesn't want you, to be his ally. What would be the good mechanisms of changing this situation?
Well, your question presupposes that Ukraine being friendly with the United States, to put it in a crude way or in a more sophisticated way, beginning to be economically integrated with the European Union and politically sympathetic towards the West, is a problem. It's a problem not for us, it's a problem for Putin.
Well, that's obvious.
But why should it be a problem for Putin?
Because if Mexico would stick to the, the values of Northern Korea, that would be a huge problem for America.
I get it. There's a strong feeling about double standards being applied, but it's still not clear that that's a really big problem for Russia. A prospering Ukraine trading vigorously with the Russian Federation isn't awful. A Ukraine, even as part of the European Union, isn't threatening. I would actually go so far as to say, although I realize that most of your audience won't accept this, that a Ukraine inside NATO is not threatening, because nobody, no Russian colleagues that I speak to actually believe me, but I did work inside this organization twice, and with it quite a lot in my career, and it is in its DNA incapable of taking offensive action against a country that is causing no problems. It has absolutely no ambitions towards Russia, and yet I know the feeling is different. So I think we should have been smarter about recognizing the depth of both President Putin's latest convictions, which have developed over many years, and about the way in which much of Russia's population shares his concerns about Western double standards or about the threat from NATO. Could we have done anything about it? I'm really not sure.
Really?
I ask myself again and again this question because we're now in a terrible situation for everybody, for the West as well as for Russia, not to say anything of the catastrophe that has befallen the people of Ukraine.
I think even NATO could do a lot. Why not consider taking, before the war, of course, why not consider taking Russia into NATO? I mean, the best way to control an enemy, as Lao Tzu said, is to embrace him. So
Yeah.
if everyone was so afraid of Russia for so many years, why not embrace Russia with all the democratic institutes you can only share with them?
В 2000 году, во время визита в Москву уходящего со своей должности президента США Билла Клинтона, я спросил его, а как Америка отнесется к тому, чтобы принять Россию в НАТО? Не буду раскрывать все подробности той беседы. Но реакция на мой вопрос внешне выглядела, скажем так, весьма сдержанной.
That would be the logical next step beyond what NATO actually did, which was to bring Russia and Russians into NATO headquarters, NATO committees, more or less from the top to bottom of the organization, a tremendous amount of business done jointly. And why did NATO not bring Russia in? Two things. I mean, one was that it was actively considered, and if you ask my colleague in the European Leadership Network, George Robertson, he will tell you that he actually asked this question of President Putin, and President Putin declined for whatever reason. But there's a more fundamental point here, and it's a serious geopolitical one, which is that NATO is an organization that operates by consensus. It really does. So any single member can block virtually anything that goes on in that organization. And I honestly think that from the end of the Cold War, 91, through to when the relationship with Russia turned sour, let's call it the 2008 Georgian War, there was not enough confidence that Russia would not exert that veto power inside the alliance in a destructive way. We'd had the tragic falling out between Russia and the West over Kosovo in the late 1990s. And it was absolutely clear that in the Security Council, Russia was ready to exert a veto rather than to negotiate a solution. That experience, I think, made it harder to imagine bringing a Russian veto into NATO.
Russian propaganda in this place would always say, and I would repeat it because I want to have this answer for the Russian audience. Because in this place, Russian propagandistic channel would always say, but America also broke many times those international laws, and they would say about bombings of NATO in Yugoslavia and so on. So can you explain what is the difference to your mind? Why some crimes of the Americas, for example in Iraq, that already there is evidence that there were no chemical weapons and so on, were never resolved in the same matter? Is it why it happens?
Well, I'm not going to. There's a description of of this question is called whataboutism. What about slavery? What about the civil rights movement? What about
yeah, but when you say about Ukraine, it's also whataboutism, because I'm asking about Russian people living alone and having to go out to fight Putin, and at the same time you always say, but I don't care because Ukrainians are having bombs.
It's directly related. It's happening in the same minute of the same day. It's coming from one country to the other country. Ukraine is being bombed by Russia.
But it's also what about it?
The Russian people are supporting the leader who's bombing and killing the Ukrainians. It's we can all look back at slavery in the United States and say, yes, the United States and slavery, it's terrible, horrible, terrible. But that has nothing to do with how one responds to an act of mass murder, which is going on right here, right now, as we speak.
But don't you think it's just a rule of who has more power?
I think we can debate theories all we want. There's a war taking place right now where millions of people have been horribly affected. And that's all we can think about right now is the people who are being killed and displaced, not the people who can't use their credit card in Russia.
That it presumes that if the West would react to these events in Crimea more harshly, maybe what happens now will never happen. So do you agree with this statement?
We'll never know. It's all hypothetical. There is no question that NATO countries, with hindsight, would say they did not react strongly enough to the annexation of Crimea and the intervention in Donbass.
But you think it was a mistake now, looking back?
It may have been a contributory factor to what has happened, yes. I don't think, I think two things. One is that I'm not sure it would have changed what Moscow has decided to do, but I can go into detail on that. And the other is that actually NATO wasn't capable of doing more than it actually did in response to 2014. There were incredibly difficult discussions inside the alliance running up to the Wales summit about how NATO should respond militarily in terms of its defense posture or politically, although it chose to let the European Union lead on the economics. And the best it could come up with was to put in a battalion in each of the Baltic states to reassure Baltic allies and to create what I called at the time a sort of speed bump with spikes in case Russia tried to do anything. How many men is a battalion? 1,000, 1,500? Nothing.
What was your personal feelings when everything happened? You said that just after these events you left NATO, but at the very events you were there. So what were your feelings? Were you shocked, or it was something not taking that much serious?
I don't think I took it seriously enough at the time. I don't think most of the rest of NATO did. I think my Polish colleague, with whom I had many disagreements, although we're still friends, probably would tell me now, I told you so. But the point is that NATO did what NATO could have done. It wasn't politically possible. You can blame the Obama administration, you can blame David Cameron, whatever, but you can blame Angela Merkel. A very significant factor in NATO debates was Germany, but NATO can only do what it can collectively agree to do. So you can play what ifs. I think another major one was the British deciding not to go after chemical weapons in Syria in 2013, which led to, I think, definitely contributed to President Obama's decision also, which allowed a red line to be crossed that made the Washington look less serious. So then we had 2014, then we had another shock for NATO, which was in many ways a masterstroke by Moscow, the Russian intervention in Syria.
Yeah.
And all of that you can sort of present, if you want to rationalize history, more than messy history probably justifies, is preparation for, it's battle hardening of the Russian army. We ask ourselves now why President Putin in 2014 seemed in the end not to embrace the Novorossiya project.
Back in 2021, NATO expelled 6 Russian diplomats. In response, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov announced that Russia was suspending its mission to our alliance. The dialogue was interrupted then. At the end of the same year, the Russian Foreign Ministry published a draft agreement with the US and NATO to ensure security of Russia and the alliance member states, which contained the proposal to legally enshrine NATO's refusal to further expand to the east and not to accept Ukraine into its ranks. The West considered it to be an ultimatum and refused. Do you think that if the West and the NATO alliance had sat down at the negotiating table back then with Putin, there would have been a chance to avoid the scenario that eventually occurred?
Yeah, well, I argued at the time, in those very tense months, December 2021, January 2022, that it was worth talking. And although talking did not take place, it's worth observing that in response to the Russian ultimatum, NATO did move a little bit. It offered talks on various things, missile defense, for example, exercises, etc. It talked about resuscitating the NATO-Russia Council and about having themed discussions. These were all, with hindsight, very small gestures, but nonetheless real ones on NATO's part. And we should not lose sight of them. But again, with hindsight, there were 200, 250,000 Russian troops on Ukraine's border, and they invaded. And it is very clear with hindsight that no small steps such as NATO.
But you know, like how those negotiations on high level goes. You always ask for more, you get less. So I think, of course, now we can only discuss it, but I think it was like a bargain. If NATO say, of course, we cannot go to the borders, but we can guarantee Ukraine, that would be a deal that probably would be enough. No?
With, maybe. All I can say, I've never been a big admirer of Russian diplomacy, I'm afraid.
To put it mildly.
I mean, I just say that as a professional diplomat. I think that quite often in the Russian diplomatic culture, the demand is too stark. It overreaches and it alienates the interlocutor rather than engaging them in a bizarre bargaining process. What was being asked for were things that NATO is incapable of giving, really. There would be no consensus, I repeat this point about consensus inside the alliance, for abandoning the principle that NATO is open to any country that can contribute to its defense. So with hindsight, NATO almost certainly should not have said in the Bucharest summit of 2008 that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of the alliance.
We support MAP for Ukraine and Georgia. Helping Ukraine move toward NATO membership is in the interest of every member in the alliance.
But you might stop NATO from saying that kind of thing again, but you can't stop NATO from saying that in principle, countries have the opportunity to join if there is a consensus inside them. I think I'm right that the invasion of Ukraine has polarized things and made the irreconcilable even harder to reconcile. So I regret that I'm not a believer in the prospect of a negotiated end to this terrible confrontation. And I fear that we are indeed, therefore, looking at a very protracted Cold War.
In your book, you also wrote that the Soviet people you saw back there reminisced you about the Russian Empire. now they say that the modern Russians
Reminisces?
reminisces about the Soviet times, and the Putin's popularity has to do with him giving them hope for getting back the lost times. Why are Russians' aspirations are directed towards the past, not towards the future? Do you have any explanation?
Well, Russia's not the only country that feels that it had a moment of glory and power, and that's fading. You can look at this country as well.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking you.
One of the things that people don't really hanker, they don't long anymore for a return of the British Empire. I mean, frankly, that's not only a long time ago, but it's absolutely impossible to recreate. The British Empire is not next door to us. It's far away in different places. The Russian Empire was the next bit of land right close to they were all together. So in terms of practical recreation, it would be possible, though probably undesirable.
But another thing is, if we're talking about this imperial, post-imperial complex, I think it really exists in Russia, and that's why Putin plays on it. Because, really 70%, even by independent sources, are supporting the war. So my question is, Great Britain, I think, is the only example of an empire who didn't have in the end, especially with India, this bloodshed war. Even France did with Algeria and, many other countries. But here, somehow, they could make a step down when they saw that there is no other way. And the second big thing, to be so great and then becoming, so to say, junior partner of USA.
Yeah.
Knowing that the leader is USA and not Great Britain anymore. How inside Britain, with the British people, it feels? Can you explain why it doesn't hurt feelings of Britons? Because for Russians to be someone's junior partner, it's something, for many Russians, it's a nightmare.
Yes, I think the thing is that the younger generation never really enjoyed the fruits of empire. Certainly in economic terms, 100 years ago, India was exploited and a lot of the money went back to Britain. But the ordinary people, they didn't benefit particularly from this. They didn't feel that, India provided us with something that we can't afford to lose or anything like that. There was a certain arrogance that Britain was given the right to control, these sort of places. But there's another big difference, and that is, you see, we didn't have a church, a powerful church that depended in its roots on other places. The Russian Orthodox Church, a third of their churches are or were in Ukraine. And that is why, for them, this is a huge wrench if this is going to be separated from them. And the church still occupies, increasingly, a very important role in the Russian mind and the Russian concept of what being Russian means. Okay, they tried to suppress it in Soviet times, but they never really did suppress that. And the church was much smarter than the Communist Party, and they outlasted them, and everybody knew they would. And therefore, the church's own position on Ukraine is a very important one. It feels the loss, and it's particularly angry that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has been given permission from Constantinople to separate from the Russian Orthodox Church. Not very many people in Russia are that so religious, but that doesn't matter. It's part of the mindset. The mindset is our destiny is partly in Ukraine because our history is partly there. Britain never felt that its destiny was in Australia or Canada or Africa. This was just the sort of place where we were ruling and, we felt powerful. But it didn't feel that it affected how we lived our lives in this country.
Most wars are about lots of things, and the reasons for them change as you go through them. But I think you really have to ask the Kremlin, the Russian government, what this is about. They did it, and they have to explain it. The explanations that people in the West have heard, maybe they don't hear accurately, but are alarming in many, many different ways. So they're alarming because, and forgive me if I'm putting words into Russian mouths, but I'm just trying to describe what I think Western governments are hearing. They're hearing that it's okay to annex a neighboring country's territory by force, something which hasn't happened really anywhere in the world since 1945, and which, particularly in Europe, brings back memories of what happened the last time that was done, Sudetenland. They're hearing that this policy could be applied to anywhere that Moscow determines was Russian historically or has Russians in it who need to be defended. They're hearing that what a leader of a great nuclear power says one day is not what he does the next. So just the untruths that surround this war.
What do you mean? Can you give example?
Well, first of all, the assurance that there was going to be no invasion, but the assurance since then of so many things that manifestly have happened, horrible, terrible, upsetting things.
Россия ни на кого не собирается нападать. Это просто чушь, бред собачий. Российская угроза – это выдумка.
That we're told have not happened. That is not a foundation for being able to do business with and between governments. These things are reasons in the West for pushing back. There's a lot of unreason, if you like, in the Western position, in my view. It's quite clear with hindsight that although it is nearly impossible for Westerners to conceive of this, NATO is perceived as a threat by Russia, I think, genuinely perceived as a threat, even though from the inside, where I have worked, it clearly is not and cannot be. There is a lot of emotion, particularly in Eastern Europe, about the experience of living alongside Russia and under the Soviet Union, which drives significant amounts of Western policy on the war now. Not all of it, in my view, completely reasonable, but all of it completely understandable. It is a contest, at least as framed by the Russian government, between different value systems as well, and is allegedly, but I think implausibly, something that is now being framed. It wasn't at the start a year ago, but now is being framed as a fight for the survival of Russia, which is also an untruth.
The courts of Great Britain for all the world is a mark of an independent court. The laws that are taken here on the West were the mark for the whole world that this is something, the real institutions that will work forever. And now, with all those sanctions and the decisions taken, and the Switzerland, where in constitution it is written that they're neutral, but they deny their own constitution, it's kind of a tricky thing, because in a long perspective, that will put no trust in a cornerstone democratic institution.
Well, I think that's a very minor consideration for people in Britain, the question of how sanctions are being interpreted here. Much more worrying is corruption within Parliament, or worrying about, extremism, trying to silence, Islamist extremists trying to attack people or silence free speech or things of that. That is a worry. And independence of courts being corrupted by politicians who are trying to stop them taking political decisions or having a say in that. The amount that those sort of things apply to a few individual Russians, I don't think most British citizens, and certainly very few ordinary voters, care about at all.
Well, in my opinion, what we have going on right now is that Putin has truly expanded and elevated and escalated international crime on a level that we've never seen before. Should everybody just sit back and say, well, he's completely broken every rule, redefined international crime. We should just not adjust international law and international response to that. We should just hold tight and just...
No, but if one person breaks a law, that's actually a big discussion, even after Second World War. Why the Nuremberg, we remember how it was done, because of course many people wanted another kind of justice, and we also have many books and examples how, for example, Jewish people with Mossad started to fight for the justice because they didn't, they didn't agree with the Nuremberg and its system. But for me, the Nuremberg was right, because they said, no, we won't be like them. We will be by law, only punishing people by law, and if we cannot punish them by law, we will not punish them.
But
same here.
Nuremberg is the equivalent of these sanctions. It's a lawful laws were passed in the United States, in the European Union, in the UK, and Australia and Canada to adjust to these international crimes. It's not like the government is just arbitrarily seizing or freezing assets. The government...
But for example, my example with Switzerland, they're breaking their own law because...
No, it's not a law, it's a policy.
Yeah,
it's a policy. That's not a law. And a policy should have never existed in the first place. How can you be neutral in a situation? How could they have been neutral during the Second World War?
But they were neutral.
But it's a terrible... And they committed terrible crimes during the Second World War, and they stole property that belonged to victims in the Second World War, and it's only come to the justice was only done many decades later. I don't think that you can use Switzerland as an example in any way, and somehow that
But I'm just saying that maybe like things written in Constitution are more important than justice. What do you think about this?
Well, what I'm saying is that law evolves over time. Crimes evolve over time, and one needs to adjust laws over time. So, for example, in the United States, the mafia used to always get away with their crimes because they understood how the legal system worked. And so the Department of Justice could never prosecute mafia crimes. And so they had to come up with a new law to take into account the fact that the mafia was running circles around them. And they came up with something called the RICO law, the Racketeering and Corrupt something law. And that allowed the Department of Justice to prosecute the mafia. They had to elevate the law and adjust the law and revise the law and modernize the law. And so that's what we're talking about here. Putin has redefined crime. The sanctions that have been put in place are redefining law.
Yeah, one of the things I'm thinking about this, tell me if I'm wrong maybe, that one of the biggest enemy of peace today is political populism, meaning that social networks, media now play a much bigger role than it was like even 5 or 10 years ago in power on West, where the elections are really democratical. You have to be very, you have to know what on Twitter will be tomorrow. And that actually leads to no compromise, because any compromise with Russia now, after all that had happened, would be unpopular. And we see even Elon Musk, which to my mind, what he says is, I won't judge, but it's quite rational.
And what about the fact that the BBC was put under pressure by the British government to change its editorial policy? Are you aware of that?
This is not an interview about the BBC.
Oh, so... You thought it wasn't?
But what he gets, like the hate and like everyone criticizes him, and that makes a big problem now. What do you think about this? Do you agree that?
Yeah, I think there's truth in that. I repeat that irrespective of the populism, I believe that what Mr. Putin believes he now needs, which is a sphere of influence, a right of control over Ukraine, and what the West's ideology requires of it, which is freedom of choice, respect for sovereignty, are very difficult to find compromises over. You know,
any compromise is unpopular thing, so
Yes.
a compromise is never easy.
That's true. You mention Elon Musk. There's also Henry Kissinger, who has argued for partition of Ukraine.
And was nearly cancelled for this in new cancel culture, because this is very unpopular views, although the reality is that, you know, Putin would never give Crimea back. I think between options of apocalypse of nuclear and giving back Crimea, he would rather choose apocalypse. So,
but there's no doubt that the way that social media and politics play out, the mindsets on both sides of the divide, which are quite full of a sort of cancel culture mentality, the very rapid stereotyping of the adversary that happens in any war, all of these things make compromise
what should
more
happen
difficult.
so that some of the big Western players would take an unpopular compromise with Russia? What should happen so that, I don't know, Biden or McFaul or Stolz would say, okay, we're ready to discuss something unpopular to stop the war, to stop the people dying every day?
I can't see it. Lack of imagination on my part. Wars change objectives. They lead to mission creep. If Putin had achieved what he thought he was going to achieve, which was a puppet government in Kiev in 72 hours, the West would be in uproar, but would be de facto acquiescing in it. They would be supporting a vigorous Ukrainian guerrilla operation in the west of the country. And possibly Russia's position would gradually erode, but the West would move much more quickly to containment rather than rollback, if you like. It didn't go that way, and I think that a lot of people in Western capitals now believe that it is not only in Western interests, but actually achievable to see a greater measure of Ukrainian success. There is another problem, which is that, and it's a significant one, which is that Western politicians have said they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. So there's a lot of Western geopolitical credibility riding on not being seen to undermine the sovereign decisions of the Ukrainian government. Behind the scenes, who knows? But up front, it's a very hard line.
Since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world has never been as close to a nuclear war than it is now, and many people discuss it. How, in your opinion, is doomsday? Is it close, or it's a bit over-exaggerated, the threat of nuclear war?
Yes, it's over-exaggerated. I mean, Russia knows, they know very, very well, that if you go down that road, it's catastrophe for everyone. And even a controlled small nuclear explosion, there would be a fallout, there would be all kinds of things, and then there would be tit for tat. The Americans have told the CIA and others have directly contacted their opposite numbers in Russia to say that. If you do this, this is what will happen. And the Chinese have said it. The Russians may have listened without wondering what the Americans said, but what they did listen is what the Chinese say. He made it clear that nuclear weapons would be only used if actual Russian sovereignty and territory was threatened. And if he feels that was the case, then we don't know. But I think the Ukrainians are also being discouraged from even, yes, they've had attacks on military bases with longer range missiles, but I don't think that would be, that's not Western policy to encourage them to do it. Western policy is to encourage them to have an aggressive posture up to the Russian border. So it's perfectly reasonable to attack Russian bases inside Luhansk or Donetsk, but not beyond.
In completely different ways, we are as close to a nuclear disaster now as we were in 1962 in the Caribbean crisis.
It's more closer than in 62, or it's less dangerous to your mind?
It is in some ways seen over a number of years closer. It's less acute. That was 13 days, and it was very, very intense. This is a situation unfolding over probably years, but partly because of what Russia has done in Ukraine, and partly because of other developments like new technologies, the nuclear risks are very high. Deterrence in the traditional sense is eroding, and no government has a good handle on this. Arms control is out the window. I've mentioned that you can accept, as I reluctantly do, that this is going to be a long-term confrontation to be managed, or you can believe that the West cannot afford a long confrontation.
What do you believe?
And that Ukraine can't either. I believe the West can keep going, and I believe Ukraine can and will keep going. But I may be wrong. So you interviewed Michael McFaul, and he recently published an article arguing that Western incrementalism over this war wasn't working. That incrementalism means small steps gradually ratcheting up the pressure, and that instead you should go for a much more aggressive approach. There are other significant voices in favor of this now on the Western side. And
more aggressive approach, meaning?
Being willing, in particular, to supply much more military equipment, much more sophisticated military equipment with much greater reach into Russia, possibly actually allowing it to be used on Russian territory, for example.
What do you think about this approach?
Well, I think it's a rational calculation, but it is probably not a smart one.
Why?
Because, this now gets into quite a lot of detail, but for as long as the Ukrainians are willing to go on fighting, the Russian army is in effect losing. It may take Bakhmut in the next few days, but it's a very small gain, and there will be Ukrainian counteroffensives. If you're dealing with a government that has got itself, as the Kremlin has, into this terrible predicament, in effect with its back against the wall, with so many defeats, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, with Ukraine possibly joining NATO in the future, with military credibility destroyed, you get, it may be a little bit desperate. It is unlikely to make it more willing to compromise, to negotiate, to find face-saving solutions for everybody, if it is suffering further humiliation in the shape of missile strikes on Russian cities, for example.
Yes, but there is another theory that it will be strikes on Russian territory. Then it will push Putin more likely, because inside the country will be, another kind of, how to say, настроение, another kind of mood in the citizenship when the bombings are here. It will give Putin an ability and will provocate him to use tactic nuclear weapon on Ukraine, which in its turn will provoke China and India leave the partnership with Russia, which is good for the West, for America. So in this, it's a cynical kind of situation, but any war is cynical. So what do you think about this theory?
Well, so far, the West's nuclear powers, above all President Biden, but also London and Paris, have been willing to take Russian nuclear threats seriously and to tread very cautiously. That seems to me an appropriate position to adopt, even if you do not believe that Russia would use nuclear weapons. The risks of escalation once a nuclear weapon is used are very great. There is a certain amount of Western nuclear theology about escalation management, about limited use of nuclear weapons, but there must be very grave doubts about whether any of that would survive contact with reality. Russia is a nuclear power. Russia is rather obsessed by nuclear weapons, if I may say so.
Not Russia, Putin.
Well, no, come on. I mean, I've watched enough Russian TV programs where people talk about using nuclear weapons to suggest that people are really quite excited about nuclear war. They worry about it.
I think it's more for Western auditory, because they know that these programs will show, because in Russia many are afraid of any nuclear...
Maybe it's just good propaganda, but there seems to be a lot of talk about it anyway.
Остановить их может только неминуемая, очевидная угроза нанесения невероятного ущерба им самим, то есть ядерный удар.
As you say, your analysis is quite widely shared, that nuclear weapons use by Russia would not be in Russia's interests, and it wouldn't. It would really be the end in some fashion.
Because, there is in Russia, I don't know if it's because no one knows that's for sure, but many people, many experts say that China made it, and India made it clear to Russia that this is a red
line.
A red line. So.
They did. That's true.
You know that for sure, right?
Yeah, I think it's clear enough. It's been repeated implicitly in President Xi's latest 12-point peace plan. So I think the consequences for Russia would be catastrophic, and I hope we never go there, is giving Ukraine enough military support inside Ukraine to inflict further defeats on the Russian army to a point where there is some kind of willingness on the Russian side to call a halt. Personally, I don't believe that the two sides are capable of actually negotiating a peace settlement, but you could have a de facto line of contact where most days there wasn't much fighting, is as far as I think Western military support should go. And I would like to see both the West and Russia taking steps to prevent the risk of greater escalation.
What should happen to your mind that the existing sanctions against Russia to be lifted? Or it may take a while, for a long time, like the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was lifted more than 20 years after the conflict has arose. What do you think?
I think it's very straightforward that the Russia needs to withdraw from Ukrainian territory up to and including the territory which was illegally annexed in 2014. Russia needs to pay for reparations for the damage caused to the individuals who have been killed and the property damage in Ukraine. And at that point, then the sanctions can be lifted.
So you don't think that it can take 20 years? You think if something will be done as a compromise from Russian side, the sanctions can be left immediately, you think? It's not that the system works the way that even 20 years, it's impossible to change something.
If Russia withdraws from Ukrainian territory up to and including the 2014 borders, up to the 1991 borders, and Russia pays reparations for the damage caused, then I don't see any reason for the sanctions to continue.
But you think under no other circumstances it can be changed?
I think that those are the circumstances that are absolutely required.
How long is this process in order for the West to win ordinary citizens who are annoyed, as we talked about, by sanctions? It needs to draw them some roadmap. Can you say what needs to be done specifically? Like, if Putin leaves, will that be enough to get the sanctions or some of the sanctions lifted? Or no, it's not enough?
This is about Ukrainian territory and reparations.
So even if there's no Putin, there's another president, it's not enough for the change of the...
Russia has done incredible damage to a peaceful neighbor. When the damage is compensated and the damage is reversed, then there's no reason for sanctions. Up until that point, that's the whole reason to have sanctions.
Problem is that, there are realistic things and unrealistic. And it's kind of a vicious circus that we are all the world is now in. Russia must suffer and stand the sanctions because 70% of the population support Putin and the war. But the West offers in Russian people nothing in return, no prospects. We already discussed that. And that makes a vicious circle go around. That I think you understand that gaining loyalty is no piece of cake. There should be some things done from both sides. At least Putin keeps paying pensions and providing food for those people. And a simple woman sitting in Russia, what she can think? Okay, I'm afraid of Putin, but still I get something. At least I can survive. And from West, she gets only punishment. So my question is, what can West offer to this woman to make her act? Because now she's in a situation where it's much more logical for her to support Putin, even if she doesn't want to support Putin.
Well, one of the things which I've been actively promoting is that the West should support opposition people who have been terrorized and victimized by the Putin regime. I think the West should stand up for Ilya Yashin, for Alexei Navalny, for Vladimir Kara-Murza, for Alexei Goranov, and others who have stood up and been symbols of opposition. You know, the mother with 3 children can do quiet civil disobedience. There's many ways to stand up to a regime, and those people who are standing up to the regime should get support. But the average Russian who is just quietly supporting Putin, even if they're don't in their heart support Putin, I don't think they deserve anything. The people who deserve something are the people who stand up to Putin.
We already talked that sanctions won't stop Putin because it doesn't touch so much Russian economy.
Well, 2 things. I think casualties are always going to be a big issue for everyone. I mean, Afghanistan, there were fewer casualties in Afghanistan, but in the end, the mothers of Russia were among the most powerful voices saying, we don't accept that our children are being sent to Afghanistan for nothing. For what? To be killed there. And this was the case in many wars. Vietnam, the American public was not prepared to pay a blood sacrifice. Now, in this war, Putin has managed to make it sound as though it's more like the Great Patriotic War. It's we're up against invaders kind of thing, and it's 1941 all over again. But only up to a point. If Russian casualties continue to be very high, I think there will be an enormous reluctance. And also, you're finding that more and more people say, I'm not going to be conscripted into the army. We've seen how many people left when conscription began. They're probably going to have to increase conscription. More people may want to leave, and also they're going to have to start to conscript people from the big cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow, which they've left alone up till now, because these are opinion-forming cities. If they start taking as many people from St. Petersburg as they're taking from distant parts of Siberia, then there's going to be a lot of resistance. Russia has historically endured an enormous amount of suffering before it actually leads to mass insurrection. I mean, look at the First World War. The Bolshevik Revolution only happened in 1917 after 3 years of war, where Russians lost an enormous number of people. And it was only because the general living standards were so bad for workers that they were able finally to say, stand up and let's do something about it. But normally, Russians will endure far more suffering, privation, hardship than we could ever imagine. That's one of the things that they say won the Russians the Second World War, that Russians were prepared to go on long after many people would have given up. And I think that is a factor. But I don't think necessarily the leadership is prepared for this. I think the people are not going to rise up in revolt, but I think there could well be splits within the leadership, within the army, within the intelligence service, within people who feel threatened by what's going on, or who think they can do it better. And I think you may find that there are maneuverings which could lead to Putin suddenly being told or declaring, I have a health problem, I will now resign. Of course, it would be done saving face, but he would be forced to resign, or somebody else would take over.
You believe in this option?
It's a possibility. I mean, if people feel he's incompetent in leadership and that the war is going badly, either the army will be so angry and humiliated that they will demand a change, or there will be a feeling that that this is unwinnable at the moment with the present leadership. And it won't be a liberal who comes in. It won't be somebody who will say, let's bring democracy to it. It will be a hardliner who says, we need to take tougher measures. But that could lead to a split in the leadership. And then what happens is quite unpredictable.
Don't you think that today's generation of politicians who have no experience of the war years often behaves irresponsibly because they don't have that experience, and that they provoke another round of escalation with their speeches, statement, and behavior?
Well, let me take one step back and say that what I do is hereditary in another way, which is that my father's father chaired the committee that designed the British nuclear bomb. So a preoccupation with these matters runs in my blood. I think it is undeniably true that Western politicians are of a generation less marked by the experiences or the horrors of World War II. Some of them still believe there are lessons to be found in World War II, and a lot of British politics is very driven by Munich 1938. Are they behaving irresponsibly? I would not go so far. They are behaving as responsibly as they know how. What they are encountering is a completely new world to them. I would be reluctant to go further because I got very tired of my father telling me what was wrong with British foreign policy while I was a diplomat, and I don't want to lecture to my colleagues who are still doing British diplomacy. Look, it's really difficult. The problems that we face today in international security, but it's going to require some steps beyond where we are now. What we're losing at the moment, you talked about it in terms of a sort of populist politics, is a willingness to talk to the adversary. Both sides are guilty of cutting off diplomatic channels or other channels of communication, people-to-people interaction, cultural. And I think we really have to work hard now on both sides to protect the diplomatic space in which compromises can be pursued or at least discussed, and to generate some fresh ideas for dealing with our complicated world.
In 2011, you came to Russia and participated in a public conversation in a cafe. And when asked why you decided to go to the Soviet Union in the first place, you said, "It's very important to love the people of the country you are writing about. If you hate the country, don't come here to work." You obviously fell in love with Russia,
Yes.
and when you came during your Soviet Union times. Have you not been disappointed in Russian people since then, and maybe you changed your view about Russian
Well,
people?
I never thought all Russians were lovely and gorgeous and cuddly. I mean, I always knew that, some people are really warm and friendly and lovely, and others have a different, attitude and outlook. And I didn't particularly bond with them or bind with them. In those days, of course, foreign correspondents, they never meet KGB people, well, not deliberately, or you don't have much to do with the government. So the people I knew were those sort of people that Westerns living there would know. The intellectuals, the musicians, the artists, the people that you have a natural link with and with whom you share a lot in common. And that is still the case. And I still am very, very sad and sorry that those friends I have and still have, I can't go and see them and they can't come and see me now. And it will be a long time before we can travel freely to each other's country. And the fact that because Britain is seen as the enemy, it wouldn't be very safe as a journalist for me to go there at the moment. And therefore, I have to just accept that, which is a pity. I mean, one can keep contact. You can send friendly messages, but you should, frankly, at the moment, not discuss politics with your friends in Russia, because it will only hurt them.
But when you were in Russia, did you find Russian ordinary people imperialistic? Did you find this kind of views in them?
Well, Russia always thought it was a great country. They felt that the West had not acknowledged the fact that it was basically Russia that won the Second World War, which it was. Without the Eastern Front, Hitler would have triumphed, would have conquered Britain, and the rest of the West didn't really quite understand the sacrifices that Russia made. So they always felt that they'd been kind of overlooked or that they were a big power and other people should acknowledge that. But at the same time, the Russians had a terrible inferiority complex over their technical ability to run a modern economy, because in the Soviet Union, almost nothing worked. Economically, I'm talking about. And everything they saw in the West seemed to be better. So that gave them both an inferiority complex and also a certain anger, a certain kind of envy, where they feel, oh, you Westerners, you're so arrogant and so superior and trying to make us feel small. And they were in two minds. Are we really a great power, or are we really actually much weaker than we would admit?
I want to finish our interview with another quote from your book. "The moment you're confident that you understand the thoughts and reactions of the Russians is a time to beware, because you are most likely greatly mistaken."
Yes.
Did the year of 2022 prove to you that you don't understand Russian thoughts and reactions well enough?
I think it proved that to everyone. Very few people, including many Russians, really didn't think that this would actually be a serious military operation. People thought it was a game of putting on pressure, bluffing, or at least threatening, and not actually carrying out a military operation. And I still think that this was a gamble which went wrong, or appears to have gone wrong for Putin, because even if he's able to find a way to stop it, it still cost his country an enormous amount. And therefore, I think that most people, if you're thinking rationally, would say, well, he's not going to do that because it's not going to work. And probably if he thought that again now, he might say, if I had known then what I know now, I might not have done it. But I mean, he's not in a position to say that. And I think thinking you know how Russians will react is very foolish. You don't know the deep-seated historical emotions. And again, I come back to the fact you need to understand the history of the Russian church as well to understand Russian national feeling. That's where the feelings are.